What's interesting about Malik's calligraphy is that when he started learning, he didn't know the words, didn't know what they mean, he just saw their form, and then that's how he learned his first strokes.
I think what's unique about Dave and his form of haiku is because he types it on a typewriter. For him to type it out is something very skillful. It's permanent, so you can't just delete an error.
When I first encountered Malik, it was a startup event. He was sitting behind me, and then there was this very loud voice.
So I just looked at him, then I'm like, hey, what's your skill? Then he told me, oh, I write poems. I was like, that's perfect. I need someone who I can actually work with to write poems. Our first formal meeting for coffee, I think he was very quiet. So then slowly he warmed up.
Haiku is a short form of poetry. What got me interested in haiku or poetry in general is how you can actually tell a story with a lot of gaps using very little words. What I try to replicate is the essence of having a twist using a three-line structure and more observations on human nature rather than nature itself. One of the difficulties at the start is that when I set up the table, put the typewriter, a lot of people didn't know what I was trying to do. Eventually, more and more people started coming. They realized that I was actually doing poems in exchange for their own stories. What keeps me going is that people I've written for, when they write back to me 2 to 3 years later, they say that it's a reminder for them that even though they have went through tough times, things will always be better in the future, and it's a good reminder to have. So it's something they always keep with them in their wallet, and so that's very encouraging for me to do what I do.
The Malays will always be like, oh, are you doing Arabic calligraphy? And I will say, no, I'm doing Chinese calligraphy. Then they will say, oh, you mean Arabic Chinese calligraphy? I say, no, I'm doing Chinese calligraphy. When I first started out, a lot of my friends will always say like, you want to do Chinese calligraphy? You know, it's been acknowledged as being top 3 most difficult language in the world. Being not born of the Chinese culture, there are certain things in philosophies in Chinese calligraphy. It takes some time to actually understand this deep and very vast tradition. But people who do literati arts are willing to very patiently explain to me all the philosophies, what the Chinese people do and all that. So Chinese calligraphy has always been a point of inspiration for me, and it forms the bedrock of all my creative works.
My friendship with Malik is quite relaxed. His studio is actually very close to where I do Tai Chi. Whenever I have nothing to do in this area, Malik is always the person I go to.
I think most of the time when we sit down for coffee, even though it's not about work, right? We'll talk about news. Sometimes once in a while, the Chinese or the Malay philosophy will come out. And from that very cordial and casual discussion, we come out with a lot of very interesting ideas.
Working with Malik has been interesting because I don't usually consider the medium I work with. I always think of the things I write as words. But with Malik, he's very concerned about the craft, the material itself. That has helped me pay more attention to the context of where I'm writing in.
So we know throughout Chinese history, being a calligrapher means that you have to be a poet. Seeing like Dave types English poetry and I like Chinese calligraphy, I thought the emergence of these two crafts would be somewhat accordance to this tradition, but also something of a unique point.
The collaboration came about because Malik started getting interested in creating his own paper.
I was very unsatisfied with all the paper that was actually available on the market. I was telling a friend like, hey, you know, I don't like doing this because I have to cut the paper to size and all that. Then the fellow was saying to me, then do your own paper lah. So I started making my paper and I felt a sense of liberation on my part. First of all, we tried to source the material. For example, the character Ming, we took a Chinese lunar calendar from last year.
I come in at the conceptualizing stage. Which material do we use? What kind of message can we say with different mediums? So I'll put together a proposal.
The calligraphy, we write it out, put it nicely in the computer. Then after that, there's a process of making the paper. So how do you make the paper? You must take the calendar. So we cut it up in small pieces. Then after we grind it to get the pulp. We go through the process of blending. Then we pull out the paper. We use a decal, we create the paper on a cloth. To make sure that the paper is very strong, you need to press it. For small ones, we can take up to a day. After that, we take out the paper from the press, we actually put it in the dryer. Again, the dryer has also a press, and the press will make sure that it doesn't curl up. Then after that, there's a process again of pressing if time permits. Then you have a beautiful paper. After you get the beautiful paper, you have to gauge where to write the calligraphy, where to write the poem. And I'm very careful in throwing away artwork. So then after hearing about that tradition of respecting the paper, instead of throwing, you actually burn it. I sat Dave down and we talked about this tradition. So we say, what better way to actually give that piece of artwork more honor than to give it new life?
When deciding on what paper to use, we actually looked at the source and what it has to say, like whether the story for that piece of paper has ended. We found vintage letters that was a correspondence between two people in Singapore in the 60s, and then how can we continue that story today, and then can we add something new to that narrative? And that's when we decide that's a good material to use. One thing for people to take away when they look at the exhibition is also to look at the own things they have in their daily life and think about them not just as things but also the stories that each item have to tell.